Imagine you're standing on what is supposed to be the biggest, busiest construction site in the world. I mean, we are talking billions of dollars promised.
Right.
Blueprints are literally everywhere. The entire global energy sector is watching this space. And then suddenly, the bulldozers just stop.
They just shut off.
Exactly. The site goes completely quiet. So, welcome to this deep dive into the Great Green Hydrogen Reset. We are so glad you're here with us.
It is a massive topic.
It really is, because between mid-2024 and April 2026, roughly 60 major green hydrogen projects were completely canceled.
Wow.
Yeah, we're looking at 4.9 million tons per year of capacity just wiped from the drawing board.
Which is an unthinkable number.
Right. To put that in perspective for you, that is enough hydrogen energy to power every single commercial flight in Europe for a year, and it's just gone.
And, the crazy part is these weren't small experimental startups running out of venture capital.
Not at all.
These were the absolute giants. We're talking BP, Shell, Equinor, Air Products, all of them just walking away.
It's honestly a staggering reversal.
Oh, absolutely. Especially when you look at the sheer scale of the capital flight. The industry basically slammed into a brick wall of economic reality.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because our mission for you today isn't to write an obituary.
Right.
This isn't the death of green hydrogen.
No, not at all.
It's the death of speculative green hydrogen. So today, we're going to explore exactly why that massive bubble burst, what actually survived the wreckage, and how this drastically changes the timeline for decarbonizing our entire world.
Because the forecasts we were all looking at back in 2022 and 2023, they were essentially 50% too high.
Half of it was just hype.
Pretty much. We are currently witnessing a massive real-time shift in industrial strategy. We're moving away from this pan-continental fantasy where green hydrogen is piped everywhere to do absolutely everything.
Like the miracle molecule?
Right. And instead, we are moving toward a highly targeted, realistic industrial tool.
So, to really understand this reset, you have to understand the sheer mania of the hype cycle that preceded it. I mean, between 2020 and 2023, the numbers being thrown around were just astronomical.
They really were.
By mid-2024, there were 1,400 announced green hydrogen projects. 1,400.
Which is a massive pipeline.
Right. And the stated capital expenditure for all those announcements was $570 billion.
Wow.
That is roughly the entire gross domestic product of Sweden, promised to a single emerging sector. It was being driven by COVID-era stimulus money and those REPowerEU targets.
Ah, yes. REPowerEU target.
Right, which aimed for this incredibly ambitious 10 million domestic tons and another 10 million imported tons by 2030.
And honestly, that imported target is what drove the craziest part of the bubble. You had these massive export mega projects planned in places with abundant sun and wind.
Places like Australia.
Australia, Oman, Namibia. Developers were basically looking at giant patches of desert, drawing lines on a map, and just assuming they could magically ship the energy to Europe.
But as we know, drawing a line on a map is very, very different from actually pouring concrete.
Exactly.
By late 2024, less than 7% of that massive $570 billion project pipeline had actually reached FID.
Final investment decision.
Right. Less than 7%. The vast majority of these projects were basically just incredibly expensive PowerPoint presentations, sitting in pre-feasibility stages.
Or worse, they were banking on magical shipping logistics that simply did not exist. I mean, there were no fleets of ships ready to move liquid hydrogen across oceans.
And that is when the carnage started. Air Products halted a major, highly publicized plant in New York.
BP completely exited a $36 billion renewable energy hub in Australia.
ArcelorMittal dropped a plan to convert a German steel plant to run on hydrogen. And get this, they walked away even though they already had 1.3 billion euros in committed public subsidies sitting on the table.
They just walked away from free money.
Yeah. And then in April 2026, Lhyfe suspended another major project. If you were just reading the headlines, it looked like a total collapse of the sector.
What's fascinating here is, if you look closely at the data from 2025, a completely different story was quietly unfolding.
Oh.
Yeah. While all those speculative mega projects were dying off, the final investment decisions for the surviving projects actually grew.
Wait, they went up?
They did. They were up by roughly 20% year over year. The industry didn't die. It was rewriting itself in real time. It was stripping away the fantasy and focusing entirely on what was truly bankable.
Which brings us to the obvious question, right?
Yeah.
Why did so many of those initial projects fail? The research we pulled for you today outlines this really fascinating concept of the 4 economic gates.
Yes, the gates.
If a project couldn't pass through all 4 gates, it died, period.
Let's walk through them, because this explains the exact mechanism of the collapse.
Yeah.
Gate 1 is cheap, firm power. To make green hydrogen, you need electricity at roughly $30 per megawatt hour. But more importantly, you need to run your electrolyzer, which is the massive piece of equipment that splits water into hydrogen and oxygen. You have to run it for about 4,000 to 8,000 hours a year.
And this is where a lot of early models failed, right? Because they assumed you could just use curtailed renewable power.
Exactly.
The idea was, hey, sometimes the wind blows too hard at night and the grid doesn't need the power, so it's practically free. Let's just use that to make hydrogen.
Right, but that ignores the capital expenditure of the equipment entirely.
How so?
Well, if you buy a billion-dollar electrolyzer facility and you only turn it on when there happens to be excess wind or solar power, it's just sitting idle half the year.
Oh, I see.
The capital costs of the equipment will bankrupt the project long before you save money on cheap electricity. You absolutely need a steady, firm supply.
Makes sense.
Then there is Gate 2, which is bankable offtake. And this is the gate that slaughtered most of the pipeline.
I want to push back on this a little bit.
Sure.
Because during the hype cycle, we saw hundreds of press releases. Tech giant signs MOU to buy green hydrogen. Major shipping firm signs letter of intent. Weren't those enough to get these things built?
Not even close. A letter of intent is literally just a piece of paper. You cannot take an MOU to a major global bank and ask for a $3 billion construction loan.
It's like building a massive 10-terminal international airport in the middle of the desert just because a few people signed a napkin at a bar saying they, quote, might buy a plane ticket someday.
That is the perfect analogy. You're building infrastructure for imaginary passengers.
Right.
To pass Gate 2, bankable, means you have a legally binding take-or-pay contract from an investment-grade industrial buyer. It locks them in to buy your hydrogen for 10 to 15 years, whether they end up actually using it or not.
So it guarantees the revenue.
Exactly. Without that guaranteed revenue stream, the banks won't give you the debt financing. No contract, no project.
Wow. Okay, so that's Gate 2. What's Gate 3?
Gate 3 is logistics and storage. Remember those export mega projects in Australia?
Yeah.
They assumed someone else would just come along and build the ammonia carriers, the deep water port infrastructure, and the regasification facilities for free.
Let me guess. Nobody did.
Spoiler alert, nobody did.
And then we hit Gate 4, which is policy stability. This is where we really have to look neutrally at the policy landscape.
Oh, definitely.
Because the attempts to regulate this new industry created massive turbulence. In the U.S., the Inflation Reduction Act introduced the 45V tax credit.
Which was huge for the industry.
Huge! It offered up to $3 per kilogram of clean hydrogen. But then the Treasury Department stepped in and added 3 very strict rules to qualify: additionality, time matching, and deliverability.
And we should clarify, those rules were designed strictly for environmental integrity. They wanted to ensure we weren't accidentally increasing emissions by funding these plants.
Exactly. Let's break those down, because they are crucial to understand. Additionality means if you build a green hydrogen plant, you have to build new clean energy to power it.
Right.
You can't just plug into the existing grid and siphon off solar power that was otherwise going to heat someone's home, because then, a coal plant might have to turn on to replace the power you took. You have to add to the grid.
Makes sense from an emissions standpoint.
It does. Then there's deliverability, which means the power source and the hydrogen plant have to physically be on the same local grid, but it's that middle one-time matching that really caused a stir.
Oh, time matching.
Yeah.
That means you must produce the hydrogen in the exact hours the wind or solar is actually generating power.
So no banking credits.
Exactly. You can't just run your electrolyzer 24/7 and then buy a bunch of green energy credits at the end of the year to balance your spreadsheet.
Right.
Think of it like trying to run a massive commercial bakery, but the ovens are only legally allowed to turn on when the wind is blowing outside.
That sounds like a nightmare.
It is. Suddenly your logistics, your staffing, your delivery schedules, it all becomes incredibly difficult to manage. Environmentally, the rule makes perfect sense, but economically, it drastically cut the pool of projects that could actually survive.
And then on top of that, we saw the early 2025 Trump administration changes. Now, while they neutrally preserved the funding for the regional hydrogen hubs and direct air capture, The broader shifts in environmental policy added a layer of uncertainty for developers.
And when you are planning a 20-year infrastructure asset,
Yep.
policy uncertainty is just as deadly as a canceled contract.
Absolutely. The EU had their own version of this turbulence, too, with incredibly strict definitions of what legally counts as a renewable fuel of non-biological origin. So policy was just a tough gate all around.
For sure.
But honestly, beyond policy, the basic math of the cost curve was a huge disappointment. Now, if you're listening to this and thinking, wait, technology always gets cheaper over time, well, you aren't wrong.
Usually it does.
Right. In 2020, analysts projected that by 2030, green hydrogen would cost about $1.40 per kilogram. But today, the reality is looking more like $4 to $6.
A massive difference.
It is. I have to admit, I was really confused by this when I first read it. In the 2010s, we saw solar panel costs drop off a cliff because of manufacturing scale. Why isn't the electrolyzer doing the exact same thing?
It's a great question, and it really comes down to three deeply pragmatic reasons. First, the electrolyzer technology did get cheaper, but not as fast as predicted. Everyone modeled the 20% year-over-year cost reduction, mimicking that solar panel boom you just mentioned.
But it missed a mark.
Right, is closer to 10%. But more importantly, an electrolyzer is not a solar panel. A solar panel is essentially a completed product. An electrolyzer is only half of the facility.
Ah, right, the balance of plant that the sources talked about.
Exactly, the balance of plant. To actually run a massive electrolyzer, you need thousands of tons of steel piping, massive copper transformers to handle the voltage from the grid, water purification systems, and highly skilled labor to assemble it all.
And none of those things are getting cheaper.
Exactly. Over the last few years, the costs for copper, steel, and labor just surged. And crucially, interest rates went up.
Right, because these are big infrastructure projects.
Highly leveraged infrastructure plays. So even as the core electrolyzer got slightly cheaper, the interest rates and raw materials inflating the non-electrolyzer half of the plant drove total costs up by roughly 30%.
So the wrapper became more expensive than the gift inside.
Precisely. And the third reason the math failed is that capacity factor we discussed earlier.
The idle time.
Right. The early financial models assumed you could run these plants on hybrid solar and wind setups for 6,000 hours a year. But real-world field data came back, showing it was actually 4,500 to 5,500 hours.
That's a huge drop.
It is. That is up to 1,500 hours every single year, where your incredibly expensive facility is just sitting there, not earning a single dime, while the interest payments still come due.
Ouch. Well, here's where it gets really interesting, because as the smoke cleared in April 2026, a very specific type of success story became undeniably clear. We have a completely new survivor template.
We do.
Let's look at Stegra in Sweden, which used to be known as H2 Green Steel. While everyone else was busy canceling projects, Stegra just closed a €1.4 billion financing round led by the Wallenberg family.
That is massive.
It is. That brings their total funding to a staggering €7 billion. How did they survive the call when everyone else failed?
Because Stegra represents the perfect execution of the captive industrial model. They aren't trying to compress hydrogen and put it on a ship. They built a 690-megawatt electrolyzer that feeds directly into a hydrogen DRI plant on the exact same site.
And we should explain what DRI is, because it is, honestly, brilliant.
Oh, absolutely.
DRI stands for direct reduced iron. Usually when we make steel, we take iron ore, which is basically just iron attached to oxygen, like rust.
Right.
And we blast it with coal. The carbon in the coal strips away the oxygen, but doing that creates massive amounts of CO2 emissions.
Terrible for the environment.
Exactly. But with DRI, Stegra uses green hydrogen to strip away the oxygen instead. And the only byproduct, H2O, pure water.
It is a phenomenal process.
Yeah.
And once they reduce the iron, it feeds directly into an electric arc furnace right next door to make the final steel. It is an entirely closed loop on one single site. But crucially, they conquered Gate 2.
A bankable offtake.
They have the ultimate bankable offtake.
Right. Car brands like Mercedes, Porsche, and BMW signed legally binding contracts to buy that green steel. And they are willing to absorb a green premium of $80 to $150 extra per ton of steel.
Because they can just pass it on.
Exactly. They know they can just pass that relatively small cost down to the consumer who is already buying a $100,000 luxury vehicle.
Exactly. It is a localized, fully solvable economic equation. The product isn't hydrogen. The product is premium steel. We see the exact same survival mechanism with Plug Power's 275-megawatt current project in Quebec.
Why does that one work?
Because they have access to incredibly cheap, firm hydropower. The plant is a modular, manageable size, and it is built for captive, local industrial use.
And the market infrastructure is finally catching up to support this model, isn't it? In April 2026, the EU hydrogen mechanism activated.
Yes, finally.
Instead of developers just blindly hoping to find buyers, this is a centralized platform that acts as a matchmaker. It connects producers directly to real, bankable off-takers.
And if you follow the money, private equity is swarming to this highly disciplined model. HY24, which is a massive dedicated hydrogen fund, just took an 80% controlling stake in Inagos Renewable.
So the smart money is moving in.
Absolutely. We're also seeing the technology itself consolidate and mature to support these industrial sites. The fragmentation we saw early on is resolving into three clear winners.
Okay, what are they?
Well, first, alkaline electrolyzers have become the mature, cheap workhorse for steady power. That's a market largely dominated by Chinese manufacturing.
Makes sense.
Then you have solid oxide, or SOEC. This has become the go-to technology for high-heat industrial sites like steel or chemical plants,
Why is that?
because it can actually capture the waste heat from the factory to operate at much higher efficiencies.
Oh, wow. That's clever. And the third?
The third is PEM technology, proton exchange membrane. Think of PM like a highly tuned sports car engine. It can rev up and power down almost instantly.
So it's good for renewables.
Exactly. That responsiveness makes it the perfect niche technology for when you are forced to rely on variable, unpredictable wind and solar power, because it can catch those sudden spikes in electricity without damaging the equipment.
Very cool. But wait, I have to stop here.
Sure, what is it? If you're listening to this, you might be thinking, back in 2020, I was promised hydrogen was going to be the miracle molecule.
Right.
It was going to heat my house, it was going to be the fuel I put in my passenger car, and it was going to run fleets of long-haul trucks across the country. What happened to the hydrogen economy we were promised?
Right. If we connect this to the bigger picture,
Hmm.
we have to look at the harsh reality of how hydrogen is actually used in the world today. 95% of all hydrogen consumed globally right now is what we call gray hydrogen.
Gray hydrogen.
Yeah. It is made by boiling natural gas or coal without any carbon capture.
And it is a massive market. I mean, we are talking about roughly 95 million tons a year.
It's huge.
But it's not being used as a retail fuel. It is an industrial chemical. It's used for refining crude oil, manufacturing methanol, forging steel, and crucially, making the ammonia fertilizer that literally feeds half the planet. And creating all that gray hydrogen causes massive catastrophic CO2 emissions. So the realization the market finally came to is this: we don't need to invent a brand new consumer-facing hydrogen economy. We just need to clean up the massive dirty hydrogen economy we already have.
That is the ultimate aha moment. Captive industrial use works because you are simply replacing dirty hydrogen with clean hydrogen at the exact same chemical plant for the exact same molecular purpose.
Exactly.
You don't need to build 1,000 miles of new, highly pressurized pipelines. You don't need to convince millions of consumers to rip out their home furnaces and retrofit them. You just clean up the industrial source.
And when you test hydrogen against the alternatives for consumer applications, like cars or home heating, it loses terribly.
Yeah.
It all comes down to the physics of round-trip energy efficiency.
Let's do the math on that because it's brutal.
It really is.
If you want to use green hydrogen to drive a passenger car, first you have to generate electricity from a wind turbine. Then you lose energy using that electricity to split water in an electrolyzer. Then you lose more energy compressing that hydrogen to 10,000 psi. Then you lose energy transporting it in a truck to a gas station. And finally, you lose energy inside the car's fuel cell, converting it back into electricity to turn the wheels.
It's a leaky bucket.
Exactly. By the time you are done, you've lost more than half the original energy. If you just take that initial wind power, send it down a wire, and charge a lithium-ion battery in an EV or power a heat pump in a house, it is vastly more efficient and dramatically cheaper.
That is exactly why hydrogen for light transport and building heat is being completely written off by serious investors. The physics simply do not support the economics.
So, looking at the global landscape now, with all the fantasy stripped away, what are the real numbers? The realistic 2030 forecasts now show operational capacity will likely be 25 to 40 gigawatts.
Which is still significant.
It is. That is a huge leap from the 2.5 gigawatts we have today, but it is a tiny fraction of that 150 gigawatt pan-continental fantasy from a few years ago. Total low-carbon demand is looking like 10 to 15 million tons.
And the geography of the industry has shifted completely alongside those numbers. Europe is the visible cluster of success places like Sweden, Spain, and Germany, where policy and heavy industry are aligning.
What about China?
China is building massive capacity, dwarfing the rest of the world, but it is entirely for their own domestic, captive industrial use. They are greening their own chemical plants. They are not exporting it as a global commodity.
And the U.S. market remains incredibly patchy, heavily dependent on how the Treasury rules are finally interpreted and enforced project by project. Meanwhile, those great export hubs we talked about, Australia and the Middle East, they have quietly pivoted.
They have.
They aren't trying to export liquid hydrogen anymore. They are focusing on turning it into domestic green ammonia.
Now, with all these pipelines failing and projects being canceled, some might be thinking, why not just use natural gas to make hydrogen, but put a giant filter on the smokestack to capture the carbon?
Right, that's what the industry calls blue hydrogen. Wasn't that supposed to be the savior if green hydrogen stumbled?
It was pitched that way, but blue hydrogen is facing the exact same bankability problems. Look at BP. They just canceled their major H2Teesside blue hydrogen project in the UK.
Oh, wow. Why?
Because to make blue hydrogen work, you are still exposed to the extreme price volatility of natural gas markets. And worse, you rely on massive CO2 pipelines and underground carbon storage infrastructure that, in most parts of the world, simply does not exist yet and faces massive local opposition.
So, what does this all mean if you're walking into a strategy meeting tomorrow, or you're just trying to understand where the energy transition is actually heading? The core takeaway is that the 2025-2026 call was incredibly painful, but it was absolutely necessary.
I completely agree.
The bulldozer stopped so the industry could look at the blueprints and realize they were building a fantasy. The green hydrogen sector that survived the bloodbath is smaller. It's significantly narrower, but for the first time, it is actually bankable and it is real.
And as we look toward the end of 2026 and into 2027, there are a few key real-world indicators to watch. First, will Stegra actually deliver their green steel on time and on budget?
That's the big one.
Because if they prove the captive model works at that scale, that template will be replicated at steel plants everywhere. Second, will the EU matchmaking mechanisms start moving actual physical volume? Third, will the U.S. successfully stabilize its regulatory framework so developers can plan for the next 20 years?
And I'll add one more. Will we see the shipping industry scale up the use of marine ammonia? Since you can't easily put batteries in massive cargo ships, they are looking at converting green hydrogen into ammonia and using it as a clean bunker fuel to cross the oceans.
That's true.
That could be the one massive transport sector where hydrogen actually wins.
This raises an important question, one that connects directly back to our analogy of building an airport in the desert. The developers have finally stopped building for imaginary passengers. They are only building for guaranteed, bankable ticket buyers now. But if the success of the most robust green hydrogen projects like Stegra relies entirely on passing that green premium down the supply chain, the ultimate success of this entire global reset doesn't just depend on gigawatts or treasury rules or electrolyzer efficiencies.
What does it depend on?
It depends on whether you, the consumer at the very end of the line, are ultimately willing to pay an extra couple $100s for your next car, simply for the peace of mind of knowing that the steel inside it was forged with clean energy.
Wow. It always comes back to the final buyer's wallet, doesn't it? Thank you for joining us for this deep dive. You are now fully equipped with the reality of the green hydrogen reset, armed and ready with the actual mechanics behind the headlines for your next conversation. Until next time.